Looking for some sweet new Dungeons & Dragons Adventures in the Forgotten Realms cards? Well, you can order them now from our sponsor Card Kingdom by heading over to cardkingdom.com. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as SaffronOlive, and I'm here today to talk to you about Jumpstart Historic Horizons. We all know Arena's expensive. We know that Historic on Arena, doubly expensive, and Jumpstart sets on Arena, oh, they're like the most expensive thing you can imagine. It's like the Black Lotus of Arena. So all this to say, when a set like Jumpstart Historic Horizons that has, with reprints, like 800 cards and it comes out, it's just not possible for most players to get all the cards. There's not enough time, there's not enough money in existence to just do it. It's so incredibly expensive or time consuming, which means it's really important to prioritize what cards you're trying to get from the set. So today what we're going to do is we're going to take all the new cards and all the new to historic, rare, and mythic cards, and we're going to slot them into tiers from F tier all the way up to S tier, with the idea being this will be kind of a guide to your Jumpstart Historic Horizons limit events, to spending your wild cards, and hopefully this will help make the set a little bit cheaper, a little bit more accessible. So a couple of things before we get into the list. One is, I also wrote an article about this. It goes even more in depth over on MTGGoldfish.com. So if you want to see the text version, you want to see even a fuller breakdown, and you want to see the packs that cards come in, we'll talk more about that in a minute, definitely check out the article on the site. Number two, this tier list is based on competitive historic play. So this is not my personal favorite cards. In fact, some of my favorite cards from the set come in at the lower tiers, but this is what cards do I need to maintain a competitive historic collection that can compete on the ladder, that can win games. Thirdly, gotta talk really quick about Jumpstart Limited, because Limited is the cheapest way to get cards, and Jumpstart has Limited with a twist. The way Jumpstart Limited works is you pay 2,000 gold. So you basically pay the price of 2 packs. And what you're going to see is 3 packs out of a list of 46 theme packs that are in the set. And you get to choose one of those packs. And then you're going to see 3 more packs from that list of 46. You get to choose one of those packs. You shuffle those packs together. You play. You get an individual card reward of rare mythic from the set for your first 2 wins. But basically, unlike normal limited, you have some control over the cards that you get. So this tier list actually applies to limited as well. Like, if you really want a certain mythic, you're going to want to keep an eye out for the pack that has that mythic in your limited events and try to grab that pack, because that's going to give you the mythic or the rare that you really need without having to spend a wild card on it. We also have an article on the site with a full list of the packs. It's huge, but it goes over where every card can show up in the entire set. It's also linked to my main article. But anyway, with that stuff out of the way, let's talk about the actual tiers and then jump into the tier list itself. So here are the tiers we're working with. Going from worst to best, F tier, that is the worst of the worst. These are cards that you can just safely ignore. They're not going to do anything in historic. D tier, the next tier up, a little bit better. They're cards that you can probably ignore, but you never know. They're better than the F tier. Maybe something crazy happens and it ends up being playable, but in general, D tier cards probably not going to be good enough. C tier was where it gets a little bit more interesting. The C tier cards, they have some chance of seeing play in historic, but they also have some chance of not seeing play. So this is kind of a like 50-50, maybe not. Once you get up to B tier is cards that I'm pretty confident are strong enough to see play in historic, but they may be like lacking a home right now. They don't just obviously have an archetype you can slot them into. So there's still some risk, but usually if you have a card that's powerful, sooner or later it's going to find a home. A tier, these are what I call archetype staples. Archetype staples are cards that I'm like very sure good enough to see play, but they typically only go into a single deck. So if you want to play Merfolk, you're going to need Master of the Pearl Trident, but if you don't have any interest in playing Merfolk, then Master of the Pearl Trident doesn't really do anything for you because it's exclusively a Merfolk card. And then S tier are very top tier. These are format staples. Format staples are cards that are almost certainly good enough to see a lot of play, and they can likely see play in multiple decks. So that's the distinction between A and S. A tier cards almost certainly going to see play, but most likely in a single deck. S tier cards, almost certainly going to see play, but most likely in multiple different decks rather than a specific deck. So anyway, let's jump into the actual tiers. We're going to start with the worst of the worst, the F tier cards. So new F tier cards, actually quite a few. Most of the random, common, and uncommon digital exclusive cards, Wizards played it safe. Some of them are cute or interesting. They all have new mechanics, but they're just a little bit too overcosted, a little too underpowered to show up in Historic. As far as the reprints, there's a decent number that fall into the F tier. Bizarre Trade Mage, Necrogoyf, potential Madness enablers, but not especially strong, and we don't have many Madlist cards. Endling, it's got a lot of text, but really it's just a Hill Giant. Reap the Past, there's a bunch of stuff that can return stuff from your graveyard to your hand that isn't random. And then Bloodbraid Marauder, people were hyped about Bloodbraid when it was printed in Modern Horizons 2, but it hasn't really worked out in Modern, and it seems way worse in Historic, where you don't have fetch lands, you don't have Mishra's Bauble to turn on Delirium quickly, so it seems really hard to get Delirium. Also in the F tier reprints, we got a couple of sets of tribal cards, and these are cards that the cards themselves are not bad. Like Ayula, probably the best bear in the history of Magic. Squirrel Mob, a pretty legit squirrel. The problem is their tribes just aren't good enough to be competitive. So squirrels fall into F tier. Ayula, because we don't got enough bears, fall into F tier. Maronar, rats, just not good enough for Historic. So these are cards that if you want to build a janky tribal deck, by all means pick them up, but as far as playing competitively, you're just not gonna need them. Moving on to the D tier, which, as a refresher, D tier is slightly better than F tier. There's some chance in some weird miraculous world that these cards could see play, but in general, I'm not rushing out to spend my wild cards on these either if I'm trying to play competitive Historic. And here we have 3 of the 5 new Planeswalkers: Teo, Davriel, Kiora. These Planeswalkers, they're cool, and I like their designs, and they do some interesting things. The problem is they're entering a Historic format where we have Chandra, Torch of Defiance, we got Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, we got Narsets, we got some really strong Planeswalkers, and these ones just don't seem powerful enough to compete with what's going on in the format. I'm excited to play them because I want to see how the new digital designs work, but I don't expect them to be top tier competitive cards. Reckless Ringleader, there's maybe some argument for playing it in Goblins. Giving something haste forever works really well with Krenko. The problem is Goblins is already really good at giving haste. You got Goblin Chieftain, you got Goblin War Chief. These are cards that give haste to everything, and they do other things, so I just don't think Goblin has room for Reckless Ringleader. Moving on to the reprints. Wonder, I don't really know what you do with it in the format. There's no Dredge style deck, there's no Vengevine style deck, so maybe it gets there eventually, but for now, I don't really think it does enough. Chainer Nightmare Adept, I'm not very high on the Madness archetype. We just need another couple sets of Madness cards, plus it's a 4-mana 3/2, which is stats that lead to it dying really easily. Parallel Lives, it's literally Anointed Procession, and one of my favorite things to do on Arena is to break Arena by copying Anointed Procession, and Parallel Lives definitely helps there, but because Anointed Procession has been in Historic for quite a while now, and it hasn't done anything from a competitive perspective, I think it's pretty safe to say Parallel Lives probably not going to be super competitive either. Tribal-wise, oh, I'm probably going to get yelled at for this, but Slivers come in the D tier, and bear with me, I think Slivers will get there eventually. I know everyone loves Slivers, I love Slivers, but I think Slivers are missing, well, a couple of things, with the biggest one being they only have a single lord. If you look at modern Slivers, legacy Slivers, pauper Slivers, one of the things that make the tribe work is they have a ton of 2-mana lords. All we have in Historic is Predatory Sliver at this point. So because there's a big cost to being like 5 colors, I feel like this is a tribe that needs another couple sets of support to really get there. You can definitely build a janky fun Sliver deck and maybe even win some games with it, but I think it needs another set or 2 of Slivers to really be competitive in the format. Moving on to the C tier, and the C tier, you see it's titled Maybe, and I think this is actually a pretty good term for it. These are cards that I would say are probably not going to see Historic play, but they also have something going for them where they're in the conversation, and it would not shock me if some of these cards ended up seeing play. As far as the new cards, we actually got a pretty big list here, starting with 4 different removal spells: Static Discharge, Sarkhan Scorn, Ethereal Grasp, Davriel's Witherling. All of these cards I don't think they're staples. I don't think you're going to see decks playing 4 of these cards, but they each have something going for them that puts them in the conversation. Static Discharge, it's like a bad Lightning Strike, but the second copy is a Boros Jar. The third copy is a Lightning Axe. That's a lot of damage for a burn style deck. So I do think Static Discharge could see play in burn. Outside of burn, I don't think you'll play it, but maybe specifically in a burn deck, it could be pretty powerful. Sarkhan Scorn, it's really slow. On turn 3, it's 3 damage to a creature or planeswalker. We have Soul Seer that does 5 damage to a creature or planeswalker with upside with indestructibility on turn 3. So Sarkhan Scorn, it's pretty bad until like turn 5, turn 6. However, in the late game, it is 3 mana kill basically anything, and red decks do struggle with big things sometimes. Like, because their removal is damage based, if your opponent plays a 6 toughness creature, a 7 toughness creature, red decks have a hard time getting rid of it. So maybe if there's like a mono red control deck that's looking to go long, who knows? Maybe this is bad in the early game, but you play a copy or 2 to deal with big things in the late game. Ethereal Grasp, there's a ton of enchantments that basically do the same thing, tapping down a creature. I think that Ethereal Grasp is the best of these cards because it's a spell for one thing. So it triggers your Talrand or Young Pyromancer or Magecraft's energies, and also because it's not an enchantment sitting on the battlefield so your opponent can't kill it. The problem is all the other versions of this are just stone unplayable. No one plays the tap down your creature removal spells. I'm not sure that being an instant rather than an enchantment is enough to really change that. Davriel's Witherling, boy, it's competing with Fatal Push. It's competing with Blood Chiefs. There are some really strong, flexible 1-mana black removal spells. It does have upsides against specific cards, against Cauldron Familiar, Arclight Phoenix. Giving those cards -1, -2 perpetually essentially deals with them forever, something Fatal Push, Blood Chief Cirrus can't really do, but those situations are pretty narrow. If a meta is dominated by cards where the -1, -2 perpetually is really good, like the Arclight Phoenixes of the world, then I could see Witherling at least being a sideboard card. But for now, I think it's more of a fringe card. Next, we have 2 different cards that compared to older cards. Sky Shroud Lookout, basically a upgrade on Elvish Visionary. Bounty of the Deep, an upgrade on Divination. The only problem with these cards is even though they're better than old cards that have seen some amount of play in the past, neither Divination or Elvish Visionary actually sees play in Historic now, and I'm not sure a slight upgrade. Like Sky Shroud Lookout, it's Elvish Visionary, except you always draw an elf and it has a reach, or Bounty of the Deep. It is a Divination, except you have some flexibility with, based on the number of lands or non-lands, you're going to draw ideally something that's better. So it is an improvement over Divination, but is that enough to make these cards playable? I'm leaning towards no. If either one sees play, maybe Sky Shroud Lookout, but Elves has a lot of good stuff going on, so I just don't think there's room. Manor Guardian, I was kind of excited about this card at first. A 3-mana 4/3, reasonable stats on a black card. I was thinking like mono black aggro. However, the more I thought about it, when it comes down to it, this does essentially draw each player a card, and I couldn't come up with many examples of creatures that have symmetrical draw attached to them seeing play. So I still think there's some chance that its good stats make it at least testable in like mono black aggro, but I'm a little bit skeptical. Then we have 2 cards that are incredibly hard to evaluate. Tome of the Infinite, Pool of Vigorous Growth, 2 of the most random cards in the entire set. Tome of the Infinite, when you think about it, it's a 3-mana artifact that for 1 mana draws you a card. The problem is its spellbook of iconic 1-mana spells is really inconsistent. If you're playing this in a control deck, sometimes you're going to hit a Assault Strobe that does nothing. If you're playing this in an aggro deck, sometimes you're going to hit a Fog that does nothing. So the value of the card that you're drawing might actually be less than just drawing a random card from your deck. I think it probably is, but it still is technically a really steady, cheap form of card advantage. So I don't know. Will the randomness keep it from seeing play? Will the fact that it's 1 mana draw a card each turn make it playable? We'll have to wait and see. For now, gonna play it safe in the C tier. Pool of Vigorous Growth, basically Momir Avatar on an artifact. There are reasons to like this card. In the late game, once you get up to like 7 mana or 8 mana, every single turn, no matter what you draw, you know you're getting a 7 or 8 mana creature. You just discard the random land you drew, make something big. Sure, you can't control what you get. It could be the worst 8-drop, or it could be the best 8-drop, but really, especially on Arena that doesn't have all the janky old cards, any 8-drop is going going to be relatively good. So I like this as a mana sink. I like it as flood out protection. On the other hand, it reminds me a bit of Vivian's Arcbow. And Vivian's Arcbow, same mana cost, does something similar, but with your deck and you can use it at instant speed, hasn't really caught on. So I don't know, maybe some sort of mana sink in a ramp deck, maybe a way to fight through counters against control. Once you get it down, your opponent can't counter the tokens that you're making. So that's kind of an upside. I can see reasons to play this card, but you need a lot of mana to get it going. It can be killed by removal, and it's random. So there are going to be times when you just don't hit the card that you want. There's going to be lots of times when you don't hit the card that you want because you can't control it. As far as C tier reprints, we have 10 of them all together, starting with a group of cards that all potentially have homes, but I'm not sure they actually work in those homes. Rise and Shine, there's a Black Staff of Waterdeep artifact deck that's been running around. The problem is Rise and Shine can only turn a non-creature artifact into a 4/4 creature, and most of the in-soul artifact style decks in Historic are trying to use Ornithopters and Ginger Brutes rather than non-creature artifacts. So I kind of feel like the non-creature restriction probably keeps it from seeing play. If this could hit creatures as well, it would be a huge upgrade over Animating Fairy or whatever in those decks. Handwer Militia Captain, there's just too many humans running around. Cordial Vampire, Vampires is a deck in Historic, but they're not really sacrifice themed. I'm not sure you can trigger its death ability often enough to make it worth it, although this is one to keep in mind because we know we're getting a full Vampire set. In a couple of months we go to Innistrad, and you can build a Immerstrom Predator version or a Yahenni version of vampires with more sacrifice stuff going on if you want to. So I don't think you just slot this into tier vampires, but it is powerful enough that if the right cards come along, it could make its own version of vampires. As far as Braze Apprentice, I like that it puts 2 artifact bodies on the battlefield in something like Tempered Steel, maybe the Black Staff of Waterdeep deck. The problem is, I'm not sure those decks want to be red. White is the base color, especially with some of our new additions that we'll talk about later. Blue's probably the secondary color. 3 colors, is it worth it for Braze Apprentice? I feel like it's good, but it's not good enough that I actually want to slot a 3rd color in my deck to take advantage of it. We also got Miss Syndicate Naja, and I'm really hyped for ninjas. I am so excited for Ninja the Deep Hours Ingenious Infiltrator. The problem with Miss Syndicate Naga in specific is I'm not actually sure it makes a ninja deck. If you've ever played modern ninjas, it's Deep Hours and Infiltrator that are the key cards. Miss Syndicate Naga, yeah, it's kind of small, it dies easy, it costs 3 to ninjutsu. Maybe it shows up in Historic Ninjas just because there's not a lot of other options, but I'm on the fence. Even if ninjas are good, is Miss Syndicate Naga part of it? I'm not actually sure. Territorial Kavu, insane in Modern. The problem is, to make it insane, you really need the fetch land, Triome, Shockland mana base. In Modern, this is consistently a 2-mana 5/5 with upside. I don't think you can do that in Historic. We don't have the fetch land. Sure, we got Triomes and Shocks, but it's going to be much less consistent. So I think this is probably going to be a 2-mana 2/2, a 2-mana 3/3, and that's more okay than super exciting. Maybe there's some rebuilt, 5-color Niv deck that goes more aggro that can take advantage of it. But until we get fetch lands in Historic, I'm kind of thinking Territorial Kavu is an okay threat that could maybe show up in some decks rather than one of the better threats in the format. We also have Zabaz and Ave in the C tier, and these are 2 cards that I think can see play, but not in the way you might think. So Zabaz is mostly a Hardened Scale style card in Modern, where you're playing all your Hangerback Walkers and Walking Ballistas and Arcbound Ravagers. We don't have those cards in the format. On the other hand, we were just talking about the artifact decks. As a 1-mana 1/1 artifact creature that benefits from Tempered Steel or could be pumped by Black Staff, this actually seems reasonable. So I think maybe it's got a chance to show up just in artifact aggro style decks in some number. As far as Ave, I don't think you can build traditional Storm with Ave in Historic. Triple Grain is just asking too much. We have Stormed in Historic, and it's really sweet. The problem is you don't have rituals, you don't have Mana Morphos, so I have no idea idea how like our Burgy Storm style deck could cast a triple green card. On the other hand, I think Ave could be a really sweet finisher in Bard class. In the Bard class, like Legend Storm deck, you're going to play through your entire deck when things go well. And the idea is you make a huge board and then you play something like Samet that gives mass haste, and then you just smash your opponent and win the game. Ave seems like a great like one of, maybe a two of, where as you combo off and play your deck, eventually you hit it, you play it, you get a million copies, then you play your haste thing, then you attack with all the oozes and win. So I don't think you could build Storm, but in Bard class Legend Storm, Ave could actually be pretty sweet. Moving on to B tier, which this is the has potential. These are cards that maybe don't have a guaranteed home, but they're strong enough that I think there's a chance they actually do something in Historic. So starting with the new digital exclusive cards, Skyshroud Ambush, 2 mana, fight something. If you win the fight, draw a card at instant speed. This is competing with Blizzard Brawl in Primal Might in the like mono green removal package. Is it better than these cards? It is 1 more mana compared to either of them. Blizzard Brawl gives Indestructible, Primal Might can be a pump spell in the late game. However, Skyshroud Ambush is an instant, which can open up some big blowouts with the fight spell, and cantripping when you win a fight actually seems really powerful. So while I'm not sure it's better than Blizzard Brawl and Primal Might, it's interesting enough, unique enough, and close enough that I think that it's at least worth testing in your green fight removal package. We also got Shoreline Scout, Merfolk 1-drop. The big reason this has a chance is, well, it can be a 2-1 for 1, as long as you have a Merfolk or Island come into play each turn, which you should in your Merfolk deck. So Merfolk Savannah Lions, they can also turn your Merfolks or land into Tropical Islands, so you can kind of skimp on lands a little bit and still hit your land drops. The big reason I think it's got a shot is there's just not that much competition in the Merfolk 1-drop slot. Like, Humana Speaker is fine, Benthic Biomancer's okay, so I think that there's just not a lot that can keep Shoreline Scat out of the deck. It might end up the default 1-drop alongside Humana Speaker, just because there's not a lot of other cards competing for that slot. We also have Sarkhan, Wanderer of Civ, which the +1's insane. +1, your dragons in hand perpetually cost 1 less to cast and can be cast with X generic mana rather than colored mana. In some sort of 5-color dragon deck, that ability is really, really powerful. The only problem is dragons have a lot of ramp. You got Sarkhan Fireblood, which ramps and loots. You got Dragon Sword, which ramps and draws cards. Orbit Dragonkind, which ramps and kind of tutors for dragons. Do we need a 4-mana Sarkhan? Is that part of the package? I could certainly see it showing up in 5-color dragons, but again, there's just a lot of other similar cards that it's going to have to beat out. Benelish Partisan, maybe in the cycling decks. Cycling is a deck in the format. Whether or not Benelish Partisan is worth it in the main deck, I'm not 100% sure. The upside is it is recursive. It's really good against removal. The downside is 2 mana to cycle, which is a bit slow, and it isn't that big at first. Like, even if you cycle it and get it back into play, that's a total of 4 mana, and you're getting a 2/2 with lifelink. Well, that's something, but it's not a lot of something. So the other thing that scares me a little bit is the cycling decks are built around Zenith Flare. Zenith Flare cares about the graveyard, so people bring in their Rest in Pieces, their Leyline of the Voids to fight cycling, so you might accidentally be playing into the hate by adding Benelish Partisan to your deck. So I think it's a card that people are going to 100% test in the cycling deck. Whether or not it sticks around, I don't know. Perpetually is a weird mechanic. We've never seen anything like it. A little hard to evaluate. We'll have to wait and see. We also have Subversive Acolyte, which is a card I really like. 2 mana 2/2, pay 2 and 2 life to turn into a Roxwar Monk or a Phyrexian Negator. There's some really nice flexibility. Like, on turn 3 against aggro, a 3/4 lifelink is great. And then against control, if you're not really worried about your opponent throwing a lightning bolt effect or having blockers to mess with your Phyrexian Negator and make you sacrifice your permanents, you can turn this into a 5/5 and just go to town against like blue-white control. So the flexibility is good. Is there room in mono black aggro? Maybe some sort of black devotion deck where this can stall out until you get to Grey Merchant, take advantage of the double black mana symbols. So I think the card is certainly powerful. Not 100% sure where it fits though. As far as the reprinted B tier cards, Whoo, we got a long list to talk about. We got Diregraph Colossus, Dark Salvation, and also Undead Augur, 3 new zombie cards. And there's a lot of good zombies in the format. There's multiple lords. There's Cryptbreaker, there's Liliana Untouched by Death. So I feel like the pieces exist for a zombie deck to be good in the format. Honestly, out of all these cards, it's the uncommon Undead Augur that I think is the biggest deal for zombies. Dark Salvation, it was powerful in Standard. It might just be too slow, though, for Historic. And then Diregraph Colossus, it's okay, but not really a staple, hasn't made it in Modern. So we'll have to see. I do think that Undead Augur improves zombies, and the pieces are there to make a sweet zombie deck, but whether or not the rare reprints actually make it in large numbers in the deck, that's up for debate. We also got Goblin Engineer, Goblin Dark Dweller, 2 Modern level playable cards, but cards that lack an obvious home. Like in Modern, Goblin Engineer assembles combos like Thopter Sword. We don't really have combos for it in Historic. I guess you can play it as just like a value card in some sort of artifact deck, but I don't know, is that going to be enough? I've heard some people talking about like using it as an entomb to get a big artifact in the graveyard and then like trash for treasure or refurbish it, maybe God Pharaoh's Gift. So I think there are shells that can take advantage of it, but it doesn't have an obvious just like, oh, this goes right in the deck, we're going to play it type home. Goblin Dark Dweller, good at flashing back Stone Rains. I think Historic Ponzo will probably play it, but that's basically a meme deck. But still, it's got a good set of stats. Flashing back a Kolaghan's command, Prismari command from your graveyard offers a lot of value. So maybe some sort of like mid-range Jun style value deck could take advantage of it. But just like Goblin Engineer, there isn't really a ready-built home. So both cards are powerful. They're of a power level that they certainly can see top-tier play in Historic, but someone's going to have to figure out where to put them to use. We also got Harmonic Prodigy, which, oh man, I'm so excited about this card. Harmonic Prodigy, Panharmonicon on a 2-mana 1/3 prowess body, but only for Shaman and Wizards, and it works on any triggered ability. So the main reason I'm excited about Harmonic Prodigy is it's absurd with Burning Tree Emissary, and Burning Tree Emissary already a Historic staple. Essentially, if you get Harmonic Prodigy down, each Burning Tree Emissary makes 4 mana with its ETB, so you're like plus 2 mana. This allows you to have some crazy turns. If you've ever seen the Burning Tree Emissary decks go off in Historic, imagine that if your opponent's ending that chain with Questing Beasts or Vivians or whatever, because they have so much mana. We also got Rage Forger in Historic Horizons, which is a great finisher for the Shaman style deck, doubling up that trigger, getting the big Hell Rider. The other reason to be hyped about Harmonic Prodigy is Historic is the one format where we've actually seen Prowess Wizards be decent, with like Adliz, Soulscar Mage, and in a deck like that, having every spell double trigger your prowess, you're going to pour on a ridiculous amount of damage really, really quickly. So I think that there's multiple places that Harmonic Prodigy could be good. Neither of the places are top tier at the moment, but maybe it's Harmonic Prodigy that gets them there. We also have Lannis Cryptozoologist, which can't do any of the shenanigans that it does in Modern with like Academy Manufacturer, but in Historic, it seems like a good Coco target. Like, play it in just a Bant Creaturey Coco deck, and this is your kind of tireless tracker. Just makes a bunch of clues against control, gives you a way to keep drawing cards, fighting through the removal spells. So I don't see the combo potential that it has in Modern, but I think in Historic, as a fair card, Lannis could still be pretty good. We also got Return to the Ranks, which is like a card away from being insane. Return to the Ranks, it's a reanimation effect, normally played in Aristocrat Sacrifice decks, and we have in Historic multiple Blood Artists. We got stuff like Stitcher's Supplier to fill the graveyard. All we really need is a sack outlet that costs 1 or 2 mana. And then you just like play your stuff, sack your stuff, reanimate your stuff, sack it all again. Right now you can do it with Woe Strider, but ideally you want to be able to reanimate the entire combo with Return to the Ranks. So I feel like even without having the perfect sack outlet, you can definitely still build this deck. And other than getting wrecked by Graveyard Hate, it could actually be pretty powerful. But if we get that 1 mana, 2 mana, Viscera Seer type sack outlet, definitely keep this one in mind, because then Return to the Ranks could be a really legit strategy. We also got new goblin, Fossilic Mons, which does see a bit of play in Modern. The problem is, current build of goblins in Historic is just all about getting to Muxus as quickly as possible. Doesn't really need this 3-mana value-y goblin like Mons. That said, there's some really good goblins that just haven't made the cut in the Muxus build, because the Muxus build is so focused on just ramp, Muxus. I think you can build a real goblin deck, like a Modern or Legacy style goblin deck, with Mons and Ringleaders and Sling Gang Lieutenant and Siege Gang Commanders and Munition Expert. I think that's where Mons will shine. So I don't think Mons just goes into Muxus goblins, but I think we got enough pieces to build a not as Muxus focused versions of goblins that can play a fair, grindy game plan a lot better, and that's where Mons could be a really good addition. We also, oh boy, Sarah the Benevolent. Oh, I love this card. Sarah the Benevolent on this list in the B tier for one reason. That is, you can +2 it once and then ultimate it to get a emblem that is Worship. Worship is an absurd card. As long as you have a creature, you basically can't die to damage. You only go to 1 if you take lethal damage. That is really, really strong, and because it only takes 1 turn of plussing, it's very achievable. You can slot this into like the Bant Angel decks, maybe over a Johnny Strength of the Pride, and I think this would be very, very good, and the emblem is insane. Like, if you have a big creature or two, there are a lot of decks that just can't beat it. Gruul, Mono Green Stompy, Mono Red. There's a very, very long list of top tier decks in the format that are just basically drawing dead to a couple of big creatures in the Worship emblem. You can even go deeper. Play a Carnage Tyrant. If you have Carnage Tyrant, Sarah emblem, you're basically guaranteed to never lose to damage unless you're playing up against a deck that has like sweepers, a control deck of some kind. So I think that Sarah actually has a lot of potential just because the emblem is unique. We don't have actual Worship. Historic players not used to having to deal with Worship, and it gets to the emblem quickly enough that I think you can actually build around it. We also have some squirrel cards. I know. We put squirrels in F tier, so why are we talking about Chatterfang and Verdant Command in the B tier? The answer is, I don't think these are actually squirrel cards in Historic. Like, sure, you can build the janky F tier squirrel tribal, but these are cards that are really good in token decks. Chatterfang just essentially doubling your 1/1 tokens with squirrels and then offering removal. Verdant Command, it's basically Raise the Alarm with a ton more text, maybe gaining life, getting a Kroxa or a Cauldron Familiar out of the graveyard, maybe countering a Planeswalker ability, and Raise the Alarm already sees play in token decks. When you have a card that's already playable, and then you add a bunch more lines of text to it, that's usually a card that ends up being pretty good. So even though I don't think squirrels are good enough for Historic yet, I do think these two specific cards have potential in token stacks. Moving on to the A tier, with A being for archetype staples. And remember, archetype staples, these are cards that I am fully convinced are Historic playable, likely 4 of in Historic decks. However, they mostly only fit in a specific deck. So unlike S tier cards, which go in multiple decks, A tier cards probably go in one deck for the most part. So we have 3 new digital exclusive A tier cards, starting with Longtusk Stalker, which seems great for the energy deck. Just a 1-mana 1/1 that can grow itself and something in your hand perpetually by paying 2 energy, and it makes energy. I think that Longtusk Stalker is a really big deal for energy. If you look at the energy aggro deck, which hasn't been much of a thing in Historic, its weakest spot by far is a 1-mana slot. It's got good 2-drops, and 3-drops, and 4-drops. It just doesn't have much going on at 1 mana. Longtusk Stalker seems to solve that pretty much by itself, and even though this is an archetype stable, I don't think it's completely impossible that it could show up in a mono green deck, like playing this on turn 1. Turn 2, you attack, spend your 2 energy, pump it to a Savannah Lions, and grow your like Werewolf Pack Leader. Then post combat, play Pack Leader as a 4/3. That's a really aggressive start. So I think it's almost certainly an energy card, but it maybe has some chance of showing up in other decks as well. Faceless Agent, I didn't know where to put this card. So it is actually not an archetype stable. Well, it kind of is, but the archetype is tribal decks. I think Faceless Agent is a card you're going to want in your collection just to fill out your janky tribal decks. If you're playing squirrels, if you're playing bears, if you're playing rats, all those bad tribal decks that just don't have enough good members, Faceless Agent is pretty legit. A 3-mana 2/1 that's going to be the right creature type and draw you a creature of that creature type when it enters the battlefield. That's not insane, but I could certainly see playing playing this in a ton of different tribal decks. Good news about this one, it's in like 9 different packs or something. So if you do any Jumpstart Limited, you're probably going to end up with a playset of these by default. Then we have Freyalies, which I think might be the most powerful new card in the entire set. Of course, it only goes in one deck, which is Elf Tribal, but in Elf Tribal, Freyalies is absurd. The +1, insane with mana-producing elves like Elvish Archdruid, can potentially come down on turn 2 with the help of Llanowar elves. And then the biggest deal about Freyalies is it, I think, solves one of Elves' biggest problems. And the problem with Elves in Historic is the deck can get off to ridiculous starts. Some of the most explosive starts in the entire format, but if you hit them with a sweeper, they have a really hard time recovering. I think Freyalies gives you a card that works with your primary aggressive plan, thanks to the +1, but also lets you beat a Wrath. Like, if a Wrath is a worry, you can just start seeking out a handful of Elves, or you can even get up to the -6 and just draw a new hand with Regal Force. And then if you get Wrath, who cares? Like, you have a handful of cards you can recast anyway. So I think that Freyalies is a card that can potentially bump Elves up a tier. Maybe Elves is like a legit top tier deck now, thanks to Freyalies, or at least a legit second tier deck, thanks to the power of this new Planeswalker. As far as the A tier reprints, whoo, there's a bunch of them. We have 8 different archetypes that benefit from new cards. Number 1, Blade Splicer, Restoration Angel, joining Soul Herder in the Blink archetype. If you want to play a Blink deck, these cards are absolutely insane. They're going to be really, really good. Also worth mentioning that both Resto and Blade Splicer are not that bad in just like a mono white aggro deck. I think Blink is their main home, but Blade Splicer adds 4 power to the battlefield with 2 bodies. That's pretty on or above the curve. Restoration Angel, even if you're not a straight up Blink Soul Herder deck, can flash it in as a decent attacker. You can blink a creature about to die to removal. So I really like these cards. I think they're good in the Blink deck and maybe have potential otherwise as well. Hardened Scales, you can't build a traditional modern Hardened Scales deck. We just don't have the pieces, the Ravagers, the Walking Ballistas. But in the like Winding Constrictor Conclave Mentor deck, Hardened Scale gonna be absolutely insane, gonna be one of the best cards in the deck. So I think it is clearly a staple of that archetype, an archetype that's tier, 2, tier 3, but maybe Hardened Scales knocks it up a bit. We also got Savulin and Master of the Pearl Trident, 2 incredibly strong new Merfolk, which Merfolk, not a good deck, but it is a relatively popular deck. It was one of the intro decks at one point, so a lot of people have the Merfolk cards. They do see play on the ladder. I think these cards greatly increase the power level of Merfolk. Like, maybe Merfolk is a legit second tier deck at least now. Maybe it's top tier. Sevlin is ridiculous. Sevlin is so good that modern Merfolk dumped Luris and immediately started running 4 copies as soon as it was printed. It is one of the best Merfolk that has ever been printed. It's big, it draws cards, it's indestructible, it protects your stuff. If you could design a card specifically to improve the Merfolk tribe, it would be Sevlin. So I think that Sevlin is a huge deal. Master of the Pearl Trident, it gives you another Lord. Unfortunately, there's no real combos for the Island Walk. There's no Spreading Seas or anything like that. So the Island Walk aspect, you're basically hoping to be up against a blue deck, or else it's not really going to do anything. But a 2-mana Lord is a 2-mana Lord, and getting another one is a big deal for a tribe like Merfolk. We also got Nettle Cyst and Thought Monitor, also Mirror Enforcer. New cards for the Artifact aggro decks, Tempered Steel, Black Staff of Waterdeep, and both of these cards are really insane. Nettle Cyst is going to be hugely impactful. Nettle Cyst is essentially an all that glitters for 1 more mana that comes along with a body and can be re-equipped for the same cost as all that glitters. It is an absurd card in an Artifact aggro deck. This is most likely going to be what, a 4/4, a 5/5 for 3, and then it has all this upside throughout the game. Thought Monitor just gives you the card draw. We have seen Thought Monitor revitalize Affinity and Modern with the ability to come down for 1 mana, draw 2 cards, chain it into more Mirror Enforcers, chain it into more Thought Monitors, and build a ridiculously big board really, really quickly. The Artifact decks have already been reasonably high tier. They're not tier 1, but they have been actual competitive decks that people have been playing in tournaments, and I think Nettle Assist and Thought Monitor immediately become the best cards in these decks. Like, seriously, Nettle Assist in Historic might be better than Cranial Plating. Like, I honestly believe, even though I don't think Nettle Assist is better than Cranial Plating overall, in the context of Historic, where you don't have as many free artifacts, I actually think I'd rather just have a Nettle Assist, and Thought Monitor so much card advantage, so I think the artifact decks are maybe the biggest beneficiaries of this set. I would not be even a tiny bit surprised if, thanks to these cards, we have a legitimate top tier affinity deck in the format. We also got Priest of the Fell Rites, Sarah's Emissary to power up Reanimator. Reanimator has developed into a fringe tier 3 archetype in Historic since Elish Norn was released, and I think Sarah's Emissary is honestly just better Elish Norn as a reanimation target. Elish Norn, good with dealing with a board full of small creatures. Sarah's Emissary deals with a board full of any creatures if you name creature. Like, you just can't be damaged by them. You have protection from them, and it's a bigger body. I feel like there's some decks that just can't beat a Sarah's Emissary. Like, if you can reanimate it against a deck like Elves, against a Gruul aggro deck, like, sure, keep Ember Cleaving me. What do I care? Like, go to town. How is a deck like that going to deal with a 7/7? Maybe there's some weird out in their sideboard, but really, it should be very close to a hard lock in some of these matchups. And then Priest of the Fell Rites, it's just a worse on Burial Rites, but a worse on Burial Rites is still pretty good, adding redundancy to the Reanimator archetype. So I think that because of these two cards, and also Bone Shards, Reanimator definitely got a nice boost of power. We also got most of a Modern Enchantress deck. We got Cephas, Sanctum Weaver in Sterling Grove. So we gotta talk a little bit about Modern. In Modern, prior to Modern Horizons 2, Enchantress wasn't a deck. It's a deck we played for like budget Magic, but it was not competitive. Thanks to these three cards, Enchantress has become a real deck in Modern, a deck that's winning, you know, leagues on Magic Online, a legit competitive option. I don't see why this insane Enchantress, this insane ramp spell, this insane protection spell can't do the same thing in Historic. In Historic, we've seen a few like 9-life Solemnity decks running around, but really we haven't had a full-on Enchantress deck in Historic either. I think that's about to change, and I think these cards are the reason why. It's hard to predict just how good Enchantress is going to be, because like I said, you're going from a really low base. Like in Historic currently, it's like a tier 3.5 deck. Like no one plays Enchantress, but these cards are so strong that I think by themselves are going to make the archetype legitimate. Thalia's Lieutenant, really good for humans. Humans, we got a ton of tribe members, could still use like a champion of the parish or something, but I think this is the best human in the format now for human tribal. We've seen a few like Martyr Humans decks running around, nothing super top tier. Maybe Thalia's Lieutenant's the card that gets him there. We also have Yawgmoth Thread Physician, which I think you just slam into the sacrifice decks. Like, it's such an absurdly strong sacrifice outlet. For 1 life and sacking a creature, you put a -1/-1 counter on a creature, and you get to draw a card. It works really well with Corvold. It curves into Corvold. It works well with Cauldron Familiar. So I think this might just be a better sack outlet than like Woe Strider or whatever. It is missing its combo friends, the Undying creatures from Modern, but it's already got a ready built home. Jund Sacrifice and other similar decks are top tier in the format. I think that Yawgmoth just slots right in and makes those decks even better. Oh, we have finally done it. We have reached S tier, the best of the best, the format staples. Here we're dumping all the cards together. New cards, old cards, they're all on the list. They're in order roughly from worst to best, although again, they're all S tier, so they're all going to be good. First S tier card, Managorger Phoenix, the one digital exclusive card to make the list. A little bit worried I might be overrating this one. I was really on the fence as whether it should be F tier or A tier or maybe even B tier, but we gotta have at least one new card in the S tier, and I think that Managorger Phoenix, it is the one that has the most potential across archetypes. If there's one thing we've learned recently, if something can come back from the graveyard without any mana being required, it's probably going to be good somewhere, and Managorger Phoenix does do that. If you get it to the graveyard and cast 5 red mana symbols worth of red spells, it comes back as a 3/3, and the next time it'll come back as a 4/4. We got Faithless Looting to get in the graveyard. We got Burning Tree Emissaries and other cards with lots of red mana symbols. We can even play it in an Arclight Phoenix style deck. So I wish it had haste. If it had haste, it would be insane. But even without haste, it comes back from the graveyard for free, and cards like that are almost always good. We also have, reprint-wise, Sylvan Anthem in the S tier. In Sylvan Anthem, this one might surprise you. It's just 2 green mana, pumps your green creatures +1/+1, and when a green creature enters the battlefield under your control, scry. The reason I'm hyped about this card is twofold. One is, it's a good card. It's an Anthem, but the scry ability is really, really key. If you're playing an aggro deck, one of the ways you lose most commonly is you just draw too many lands in a row. If you have Sylvan Anthem out, you're going to be able to scry away your lands, constantly hit action, and that is actually a really, really big deal. The other reason I think this is an S tier card is because it's got plenty of homes. You got Elves, you have Mono Green Stompy. It plays really well with Ranger class. You can scry lands out of the way to cast more cards from the top of your deck. Even the Gruul decks, if you look at like Gruul, one of the best aggro decks in the format, outside of Bone Crusher Diet, which is kind of a removal spell, it's essentially all green creatures. So even though this only pumps green creatures, and you wouldn't think it'd be good in a 2-color deck, I think it actually can work in the Gruul deck. So the plethora of homes for this card and how big of a deal that scry is, I think means it's got a chance to see play in a lot of green-based aggro decks. We also have Esper Sentinel. Esper Sentinel, the card's insane. This is a card that, easy inclusion for artifact aggro decks, probably the best 1-drop you can play in those decks. It's a human for some reason, so the Thalia's Lieutenant human tribal deck can take advantage of it. It can show up in just white weenie style decks. It can show up in equipment style decks that want to boost its power and toughness to make it harder for your opponent to kill. And it's worth mentioning that in Historic, the removal is not as efficient in Modern. In Modern, sometimes you play Esper Sentinel and it gets hit by Lava Dart or Gut Shot. In Historic, there's a lot more declarations in Stone and Lightning Strikes running around, and if your opponent has to spend 2 mana to kill an Esper Sentinel, that's already a win. And if they have to spend 2 mana to kill an Esper Sentinel and you draw a card, that is an insane amount of value for a 1-mana play. That might not sound like a game-winning play, but in a lot of ways it really, really is. So Esper Sentinel, tons of home. I'm expecting it to be very, very good. We also have, oh boy, Archmage's Charm. I think Archmage's Charm might be the card I'm most worried about. Control decks, already some of the best decks in the format. Definitely tier 1. Archmage's Charm is a ridiculous spell. 3 mana, counter a spell, or draw 2 cards, or gain control of a non-land, convert a mana cost 1 or less. I think this will just immediately show up in basically every control deck. It could bring back maybe like Mono Blue, Curious Obsession, Tempo style decks. The only thing that I think makes it a little bit fair is it is 3 blue mana symbols, and we don't have fetch lands, so there is a cost to playing a triple blue card in your like 3-color control deck. So maybe that keeps it in check a little bit, but I still think Archmage's Charm, one of the strongest cards to come from Jumpstart Historic Horizons. We also have Ranger Captain of Eos, which is a card that gets better at Historic every time I think about it. Just a 3-mana 3/3. When it comes into play, you snag a 1 mana value or less creature from your library, put it in your hand, and you can sack it to silence non-creature spells for a turn. This card just has so many homes. It can show up in Collected Company decks. It can show up in white weenie decks where it can get Selfless Savior. It can get removal spells like Giant Killer. It shows up in some modern Death Shadow decks where it snags Death Shadow. It can show up in the human deck, getting like Machias, getting Thraben Inspector. It can show up in the Soul Sister deck, getting Sarah Zenit, getting Soul Ward, getting Speaker of the Heaven. The fact that there's like 5 different decks that potentially want Ranger Captain of Eos, maybe even as a 4 of, certainly means it deserves a spot very high in our S tier list. Number 1 on our S tier list, Seasoned Pyromancer. Seasoned Pyromancer, I'm almost surprised they printed it into the format. This is a card that, unlike some of the other ones we've been talking about, it doesn't have any real requirements. Like, it's just a 3-drop that puts some bodies on the battlefield. It draws you cards. You don't got to be a specific tribe. You don't got to be a specific archetype. You can be aggro. You can be control. You can be mid-range. Seasoned Pyromancer is just a good card in a generic sense. And I think that if you are playing red, playing Gruul, playing Mono Red, playing Grixis Control, you name it, Collected Company decks, I think you just play Seasoned Pyromancer. In aggro, it's a way to refill after you empty your hand. In control, it puts 3 bodies to chump block on the battlefield while you're waiting to find your finishers or your wrath. it is just a really, really powerful creature. I would not be surprised if when we look back on the most played creatures in the historic format 3 months from now or something, to see Seasoned Pyromancer very high on that list. So if you only have the wild cards to get a single mythic from the set, that would be my pick, Seasoned Pyromancer, even though there's quite a few good cards in this set. So, whoo, that was a long one, but I think that covers everything. So hopefully this was helpful. Again, I know it's a lot to take in. If it's too much, definitely click on the link, go read the article. It's in the description. I put up the card. It's got a lot of this information and more information. Make sure to check out the article about the packs and what packs to open, because honestly, the cheapest way to get these cards is not spending your wild cards. The cheapest way to get these cards is to play Jumpstart Historic Horizons Limited and know, okay, this pack has Seasoned Pyromancer, and then when you see that pack pop up, you just snag it. Maybe it's not the pack you want to play with the most in Limited, but that is such a good way to get the cards you need for Constructed. So make sure to know the packs and use it as kind of a guide as you're playing your Jumpstart Limited event. So anyway, that is tier ranking Jumpstart Historic Horizons. Hopefully this was helpful. Let me know what you think. What I get right, what I get wrong. Are you playing this set? What are you going to do to get the cards you need? What are you most hyped to build? Let me know in the comments. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I will talk to you soon.
Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.